In the fall of 1943, a small rural community in Michigan faced turmoil. Enemies were arriving on their doorstep, disrupting the high school football season. The local community was required to bus students to a nearby high school to play football, a disappointing thought, as the football season was an important event to the small, rural community. The enemy's arrival required changes to Shelby High School's football season. This change was because of World War II and decisions handed down by the War Department. Throughout the season, German prisoners of war, POWs, occupied the football field. The Allied forces captured these men in North Africa and sent them to Michigan. This was to ease the labour shortage and create room in other Allied countries that struggled to feed, clothe and house enemy troops. Instead of a regular football season, the players spent most of the season playing home games at the next town over, about 5 miles away. Marge, a teenager in 1944, recalled working at the local ice cream shop, talking with the guards while her stepfather managed the local canning factory. They, the German prisoners, were just amazed at how well they were treated, how well they were fed, and how well they were taken care of. These POWs spent about 3 years in the rural community, from the spring to the fall harvesting seasons. They worked hard and spent the winter housed at Fort Custer, a military training center founded after World War I. It is located outside Battle Creek, Michigan, at the center of the state. Today, Fort Custer remains a training center and an active military installation under the command of the United States Army. The German POWs entered the United States in 1942, after the US started the North African campaign to capture Italy, prior to the D-Day operations in 1944. Joining the Allies, American involvement helped turn the war towards an Allied victory, given the shipments of supplies and men. Upon capturing Germans and other Axis troops, the question of where to house these individuals arose. As France and Britain struggled with space, the United States, along with Canada, hesitantly agreed to transport, house and feed POWs according to the standards set by the Geneva Convention. The outline of the Geneva Convention demanded countries treat prisoners of war amicably. Within the United States, this meant supplying prisoners with the same comforts given to American troops. Accusations of coddling and preferential treatment arose from citizens because of this development, as residents maintained that the prisoners experienced better treatment than soldiers. Japanese American citizens also faced on American soil, yet their experience, though humane, was less fair. The enemy prisoners in the camps expected care in the same vein as US servicemen, as outlined in the Geneva Convention. Japanese Americans imprisoned under Executive Order 9066 did not receive the same treatment. The demand for similar care resulted a backlash from the United States government. Americans were envious as rationed products, such as meat and cigarettes, appeared in the prisoners' possession. War Department regulations forbade the exchange of cigarettes with prisoners. However, the War Department maintained that no coddling happened, and the treatment fell within the confines of the Geneva Convention. Besides following the guidelines, the War Department wanted to treat the German POWs fairly to ensure equal or similar treatment of American POWs in Europe. Yet, the War Department and the United States government did not want American citizens to have knowledge of the German POWs in the United States. Because of this, the narrative in American and German history is little known. However, the story remained in people's memories. Scholars and researchers have explored general histories on the topic of German POWs in the United States, most notably Arnold Kramer's Nazi Prisoners in America, first published in 1979, with the most recent edition published in 1996. Other notable overarching studies include Judith Gansberg's Stalag USA, which was also published in 1979. Authors have written few books on German POWs. However, recent scholarship includes many regional and state studies. Most of the current scholarship is published in journal articles, including Kevin Hall's The Befriended Enemy, German Prisoners of War in Michigan, published in 2015. This study, along with Dr. Gregory Sumner's Michigan POW Camps in World War II and Ethan Reardon's self-published R2 German POWs in Michigan, Planned Re-Education versus Fair Treatment, published in 2018 and 2019 respectively, represents the current publications of Michigan's treatment of German POWs. However, a statewide study is lacking, given that Hall does not review camps from the middle or northern portions of the state. Sumner focused on Fort Custer and their prisoners, and Reardon's primary argument concerned the War Department's re-education program. Hall and Sumner both argue that the treatment by American citizens resulted in friendships between the two groups. Reardon argued that despite attempts by the United States government to persuade German prisoners to abandon National Socialism through a concentrated re-education program, the labor program used to alleviate a labor shortage was more effective in changing the prisoners' minds. A complete analysis of all Michigan POW camps has not been conducted, nor has there been an evaluation of prisoner letters throughout the state. Both Hall and Sumner reference surviving prisoner letters to German farmers. Still, no complete narrative of camp life, the different camps in the state, nor an understanding of the relationships between prisoners and Michigan farmers exists. This study hopes to bring the entire narrative of the prisoners' experiences in Michigan to the forefront. It can provide details relating to the construction of the camps, the lifestyle of prisoners, important events of the POWs, and the impact of the relationships between the German POWs and Americans. Through the discovery of unpublished letters written by former German prisoners, the primary sources indicated that the United States' citizens circumvented the Geneva Convention in their treatment of POWs by exceeding the expected treatment. Additional sources include oral testimonies and newspaper articles detailing the treatment of the prisoners along with the initial misgivings and apprehension of American citizens. Although prisoners expected care similar to that received by American servicemen, American citizens supplied additional food, clothing, and access to uncensored materials, in violation of the stipulations set by the War Department. Focusing on the state of Michigan, which had 30 camps from 1943 to 1945, approximately 5,000 German men remained behind barbed wire. Yet in Michigan, few sites, such as Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC camps, housed the POWs. As the POW program began, the US War Department used former CCC campsites as prisoner barracks. Thus, the barbed wire associated with POW camps did not exist in Michigan. Camps existed in fairgrounds, factory grounds, and even high school football fields. The War Department allocated one guard for every 10 prisoners, allowed work details, and provided recreational opportunities. Yet, these camps were interesting to American citizens who wanted to see the enemy. Despite rules against the POWs becoming public spectacles, it was common for people to watch their arrival at the camps or stand at the fence lines, hoping for a glimpse of the men. Some camps existed within German-American communities. Camps in Frankenmuth and Berrien Springs, Michigan, both serviced farmers of German heritage who understood the language. This shared linguistic culture allowed relationships to form between prisoners and farmers, lasting decades. Following the United States' involvement in World War II, the Allies reached a decision concerning German prisoners of war. US assistance allowed the Allies to regain and liberate German-occupied territory. However, this left a question about what should be done with the remaining prisoners. Reluctantly, the United States agreed to transport and house Axis prisoners in the United States for the duration of the war. This reluctance grew out of a desire to keep the enemy away from the civilian population. However, France and Britain's ability to care for the large number of captured troops had peaked. Transported back to America in the same ships, Liberty ships, carrying soldiers to the front, approximately 300,000 to 400,000 prisoners reached American shores. Of those, about 5,000 German men, along with other Axis prisoners, were imprisoned in Michigan. They worked on local farms to offset the ensuing labour shortage. Historians have rarely written local, state, and national histories related to Michigan and German POWs. They completed many of the studies in the 1980s to early 2000s. Researchers could interview surviving prisoners and local farmers. There is no complete study of all aspects of the prisoner camps, encompassing government documents, prisoner letters, and surviving testimonies. The previous publications on Michigan prisoners of war focus on camp life, the re-education program, or the idea of an enemy. There are no cross-references between the works, as they were published around the same time, creating a gap in the historiography where the works need to be analysed in the same space, incorporating more details about the camp's construction, prisoners' lives, and the unpublished stories that have survived. However, an overarching theme concerning the POWs exists. Americans treated prisoners very well. Secondary sources concerning German POWs in America range from books to journal articles, across a wide range of topics. Some are in-depth analyses of the camps, some focus on a particular camp or state, while others mention German POWs as an element of the labour force. The early studies, such as Gansberg's study, gave a general overview of the topic, to explain this missing narrative of American history. She argued that the American government violated the Geneva Convention through its re-education program. At the same time, she attempted to give a narrative history of the fortunes of German prisoners held in the United States. Following general studies, regional and state studies, such as Lewis Carlson's We Were Each Other's Prisoners, 1997, Ruth Cook's Guests Behind Barbed Wire, 2007, and Alan Coop's Stark Decency, 1988, explored the individual experiences of POWs within a specific camp or state. Current studies focus on the individual camps, individual prisoners, or an element of POW studies, such as the re-education program. As historians have conducted further research, there emerged a drive to narrow the study of German POWs to a more personal level. The research into the prisoners held in Michigan fills a gap in the narrative literature concerning POWs in the state. Scholars have completed limited research on the educational value of German POWs, but no narrative account exists. One of the first studies on German prisoners was Wilfried Reiners's Soviet Indoctrination of German War Prisoners, written in 1959. Written with the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, this source reviewed Soviet techniques of indoctrination to compare with American prisoners held by Communist China during the Korean War. Reiners argues that Soviet indoctrination involved using several objectives, sometimes simultaneously. Fulfillment of ideological legacy, using prisoners of war as propaganda instruments, using prisoners of war as political instruments, and training an elite group. These objectives had a direct impact on some POWs, resulting from the manipulation of prisoners' environments, direct attacks upon their belief systems, and the unintended living conditions while in captivity. Following Reiners's study, Judith Gansberg wrote the first full-length book concerning the German POWs in America in 1977. Gansberg, a faculty member at the time of publishing at Southeastern University in Washington, D.C., reviewed the American influence on West Germany through the experiences of German prisoners of war. Describing the experiences of the approximately 370,000 German POWs, she outlined the experiment to combat Nazism through a curriculum approved by the War Department and created by the Prisoner of War Special Projects Division. Outlined under the Geneva Convention, the United States abided by specific rules which allowed prisoners access to food, work, and a place to sleep. However, at the urging of Eleanor Roosevelt, the US also embarked on a democratic re-education program, a denationalization violation under the Geneva Convention. Despite this scope of the convention, the schools and other prisoners were affected by their experiences in the United States. Gansberg asserts that the German prisoners were more concerned with rebuilding and selecting a type of government because of their experiences in America and their education, allowing them to see and solve current problems. She notes, however, that the system was not perfect. Many soldiers were more concerned about their families than spreading democracy. While incorporating general overviews of the topic of German POWs in America, John Hammond Moore continued the study into the German POWs with his book The Faustball Tunnel, German POWs in America and Their Great Escape, 1978. Rather than just explaining the missing narrative, Moore describes the escape of 25 prisoners from a camp in Arizona, to begin the process of more in-depth studies of regional camps and individual stories. They built a tunnel underneath the exterior fence, disguised as building a volleyball Faustball court. This historical narrative is little known, yet remains one of the few mass escapes, though the guards recaptured the men. Rather than an interpretation, Moore focuses on telling this story, which is hardly known outside of Arizona. After Gansberg's work, the topic of general studies continued with Arnold Kramer's quintessential book, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, published first in 1979 and subsequently revised in 1991 and 1996. One of the few in-depth studies concerning the POW camps, Kramer argues that it was difficult to distinguish between Nazis and non-Nazis prisoners. In addition, each camp experience was distinctive, encompassing similar research methods to Gansberg, with prisoner interviews and reviewing government documents. It is one of the major sources on the German POWs, as Kramer outlined the camps and prisoners in each state, offering a narrative interpretation of their experiences. Ron Theodore Robbins, The Barbed Wire College. Re-educating German. POWs in the United States during World War II, and Lewis H. Carlson's We Were Each Other's Prisoners, An Oral History of World War II. American and German Prisoners of War, followed Kramer's account on German POWs. Robbins' account continued the idea of the re-education program. Considered successful by the US government, Robin argued that the program was ineffective and determined the reason for the positive affirmation was the professors mobilized for the re-education curriculum believed they had accomplished a highly important assignment. They considered it more important than formal military missions by democratizing the enemy. Although a violation of the Geneva Convention, the goal included providing an alternative political ideology to National Socialism. As the re-education program would have changed a prisoner's outlook, the experience of being a prisoner on American soil would also have been life-changing. Carlson's book tells the personal stories of German and American POWs. Making use of Germany's day of national mourning in Michigan, and word of mouth, Carlson located and obtained permission to interview former POWs. Sharing a common background and similar experiences, Carlson argued that the experience was a central part of their lives. Spending 3 to 4 years in American captivity, the prisoners saw a living example of democracy, while also experiencing the same care given to American soldiers or family friends. They were well fed and given recreational time, which kept them safe from the front lines. As Carlson began piecing the oral histories together, many historians began regional histories concerning the German POWs. One study concerning Iowa's German POWs was Signs of Life, Lebenszeichen, edited by Michael Lueck-Thrams. Lueck-Thrams attempted to present the historical and human sides of the German POW experience. Using letters and photos, Lueck-Thrams argued this topic is little known, yet the collection of 282 letters showed Camp Algona's daily life and how the prisoners dealt with their circumstances. Similarly, Matthias Reiss published a journal article, Bronzed Bodies Behind Barbed Wire, concerning the masculinity of the German POWs within the middle regions of the United States. Reiss, 2005, argues that the bodies of the German POWs, specifically their masculinity, determined their treatment in America. The perception of German POWs as expert, disciplined, and fit soldiers, similar to American soldiers, garnered sympathy from their American captors. The people treated the German POWs as they expected to be treated. Capture by a foreign nation did not guarantee excellent treatment. However, as historians continued studying the German prisoners, the consensus of comparable treatment with American servicemen grew. Barbara Heisler continued the trend of similar treatment with American soldiers in the article. The other braceros. Temporary labor and German prisoners of war in the East United States. Rather than only using migrant workers from South America, the War Department authorized the use of German POW labor in 1943 to offset the labor crisis brought about by the war. Accessing archival records, Heisler argued that the German POWs became like our own boys, referencing the idea that Americans did not see differences between the German POWs and the American soldiers sent to war. Instead, the similarities between the two groups resulted in POWs being treated similarly as American servicemen, while the braceros remained outsiders in the community. In addition, a recent article by Catherine Jellison, Get Your Farm in the Fight, Farm Masculinity in World War II, furthered the discussion of masculinity among the POWs and the farmers. Facing a labour shortage, the farmers used masculine images to convince boys and young men to remain on the farm. However, when that failed, they used military labour through the POWs. The government used the masculinity of foreign labourers to portray an ideal farmer as white, muscular, and using his body to fight. The primary goal was to retain farmers to deal with the labour shortage, but it resulted in camaraderie with the foreign workers. This masculine portrayal left behind an image of a white male farmer, not one of a different ethnicity. Heisler followed up with an additional article on the German POWs titled Returning to America, German Prisoners of War and the American Experience. Conducting in-depth interviews, Heisler maintained that the treatment similar to that of American soldiers and camaraderie at the hands of American captors, both the soldiers guarding them and the Americans they worked for, prompted many former POWs to return to American shores as naturalized citizens. Being given food, clothing, and other staples left an impact on the German prisoners, as they experienced captivity far from home and away from danger. Being seen as friends rather than enemies left favourable impressions of the nation and its citizens. However, a complete narrative concerning the general experiences of German POWs in America was lacking until Antonio Thompson's Men in German Uniform, POWs in America during the World War II. Using archival research, interviews, and the previous articles, Thompson asserted how the United States dealt with, and was primarily successful, in housing almost 400,000 German POWs. Thompson presents two arguments: that the US adhered to the Geneva Convention, and that, despite the various nationalities of men in German uniform, the United States was able to navigate the problems of adherence. In addition, the United States experienced benefits, as the Americans gained a temporary workforce and fought against an ideology through practice. The German POWs benefited from the treatment that gave access to recreation, work, and religious services to alleviate the boredom of capture. The experiences of the German POWs in America varied drastically from the experiences of Germans held by the Soviet Union, and even of Americans held in the Pacific Theatre. Adalbert Holl, a soldier in the German army, became a captive of the Soviet Union. Holl experienced horrifying treatment for 7 years, given the lack of food, clothing, and working conditions he experienced. In addition, due to the friction between Germany and the Soviet Union, following the extermination tactics of the Eastern Front, their captors considered German prisoners second class, not caring much whether they lived or died. Likewise, in Japanese prisoner of war camps, American servicemen experienced hunger, beatings, and death marches as the Japanese saw surrender as dishonourable. Experiences of American servicemen exist within stories such as Unbroken, 2014, by Laura Hillenbrand, and Sorties into Hell, 2003, by Chester Hearn, discussing the high rates of death seen among American soldiers in the Pacific. Hillenbrand told Louis Zamperini's story, while Hearn recalled the experiences of American soldiers on Chichijima, which testify to the harsh reality that those in command knew their actions violated all the conventions of war and humanity and were legally and morally wrong. In comparison, the United States extended similar care to German POW, treatment comparable to American active duty personnel. Although many countries had signed the Geneva Convention, agreeing to follow the precepts of prisoner treatment, one missing signor, Russia, USSR, arguably allowed the atrocities seen on both sides of the Eastern Front. It is not an excuse for the inhumane treatment of prisoners, but by not signing the document, the Soviet Union was not bound by the same statutes. Japan, though a signer, considered surrender dishonourable. They were unprepared for the number of prisoners captured, leading to some of the harsh conditions experienced by the prisoners. Although general, overarching studies of the German POWs existed, another element within this narrative concerned the political side of prisoner of war studies. Neville Wiley wrote Barbed Wire Diplomacy, concluding that the political relationship between Britain and Germany rested on their concern for POWs and the official policy of their respective governments. Matthias Reis continued the political theme, incorporating social changes in his article Solidarity Among Fellow Sufferers, 2013. A senior lecturer in England, Rice asserted the differences between the treatment of German POWs and the African American soldiers. Building on work completed in 2002 and looking at the relationship between German POWs and African American soldiers, Rice demonstrated that despite the differences in treatment, the POWs and soldiers, both at the bottom of the economic and social ladder, developed harmonious relationships. Political contributions into prisoner of war studies continued by looking at other North American allies. A piece written by Jean-Michel Turcotte, a professor at Ruhr University, asserts that both countries, the US and Canada, treated prisoner treatment and containment as priorities and objects of concern. Not listed as a primary ally during World War II, Canada also helped house POWs. The two countries agreed on POW treatments and attempted to follow the Geneva Conventions. While studies adopting political and cultural lenses continued throughout the early 2000s, the more popular aspect of regional and state research on German POWs began growing. In his book Stark Decency, Alan Coop studied Camp Stark in New Hampshire. Combing through local, state and national records, as well as letters and interviews, Coop determined that the German POWs experienced humane treatment from the Americans, similar to that of American servicemen. However, this decency was the human element and compassion that demonstrated a light within the darkness of World War II. James Fickle and Donald Ellis continued regional studies by reviewing the southern lumber industry and the impact of the labour programme in an article published in 1990. Using essays, articles, books, and personal interviews, Fickle and Ellis concluded that America did not fully follow the Geneva Convention. Instead, it created a successful labour programme, despite a language barrier that prevented full integration and efficiency. Historians continued to examine other areas of the United States through further studies. The historian Glenn Thompson also continued this trend of regional studies, with his publication, Prisoners on the Plains, a narrative of the German POWs in the Great Plains states. Thompson documented the United States requisition of land for prison camps, the experiences of the workers, and their impact on soil restoration during the 1940s, after the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. While Thompson focused on the central United States, another historian continued regional studies by focusing on Florida. Robert Billinger Jr., a professor of history at Wingate University, documented Florida's POWs in his book Hitler's Soldiers in the Sunshine State, published in 2000. Billinger discussed the fact that the subject of German POWs remained unknown because of the War Department's desire to limit knowledge of the POW program. As regional studies progressed, the focus no longer remained only on a geographic area. Looking into the labour market, Thomas J.N. continued regional studies by reviewing the northwestern region of the United States and the impact of the POW labour program in the area. J.N., the director of the Fray Angelico Chavez History Library, asserted that America followed the Geneva Convention and that the explanation of limited publications resulted from a lack of high drama. Because of the belief that many individuals would not find the story interesting, Jane provided an in-depth review of Camp Rupert and the labour program, indicating the POWs were essential to production. Without the German POWs, there would have been a massive loss of agricultural products, both foodstuffs available for the war and those needed by the civilian population to survive. While Jen focused on Camp Rupert, another state study conducted by Betty Cowley documented the POWs in Wisconsin. Cowley's publication, Stalag, Wisconsin, argued that the POWs experienced humane treatment while being essential to the production of crops in Wisconsin. David Fiedler, in The Enemy Among Us, continued the state study trend through his book on Missouri's POWs. Fiedler argued that the Missouri POWs experienced good treatment, and the relationship with Missourians grew from one of fear to fondness. As historians expanded into the southern United States, the trend of state and camp-based studies continued. Michael R. Waters, a professor of anthropology and geography at Texas A&M University, documented the prisoner experience at Camp Hearn. Using government documents, letters, and personal interviews, Waters asserted that the POWs experienced decent treatment under American control. Interviewing former POWs, Waters gave many former prisoners a chance to tell their stories. Texas's POW story continued with Jeffrey L. Littlejohn and Charles H. Ford's The Enemy Within Never Did Without. Littlejohn, a history professor at Sam Houston State University, and Ford, a professor of history at Norfolk State University, argued that Huntsville's camp served as the model camp, similar to Fort McClellan, Alabama, and created a high standard of treatment for German POWs. Because Camp Hearn modelled an acceptable prisoner camp, similar to Fort McClellan, the study of Alabama's POWs was necessary. Ruth Beaumont Cook documented Alabama's POWs. In 2007, Cook reviewed Camp Aliceville in Alabama, arguing that this is a little-known story and that the procedures of Aliceville relate to contemporary issues of the War on Terror, as many German POWs did not return home as quickly as others, given the United States' desire to protect American soldiers in Germany. Jack Shea also reviewed Alabama's POWs in the Fort McClellan POW camp. Shea argued that Fort McClellan gained a reputation as a model camp, where both foreign and domestic officials commended the camp and the treatment of the prisoners. Additional studies included publications on POW camps in Kentucky and Massachusetts. Both agreed that the German POWs experienced fair treatment, yet the goal of these publications was to bring awareness to these little-known narratives in their respective states. As Billinger mentioned, the War Department did not want Americans to be fully aware of the situation. Antonio Thompson discussed the POWs in Kentucky. Thompson, a history professor at Austin Peay State University, authored Men in German Uniform. Thompson's dissertation argued that Kentucky benefited economically and culturally from housing POWs in the state. The POWs demonstrated a willingness to work hard and brought the war to the American home front. Yet, Thompson maintained the general theme of the humane treatment received by the German POWs. While Thompson maintained the theme of decent treatment by prisoners in Kentucky, John Bonifilia documented camps in Massachusetts. He argued that German POWs' experiences in Massachusetts affected future relations with the country, as they learned about democracy and created lasting relationships with Americans. Using personal interviews and state and government documents, Bonfilia demonstrated that the prisoners felt more affected by their direct treatment from Americans rather than the War Department's re-education program and special projects. Yet, neither work documented the camp experience and the day-to-day operations of the prison camps. Both discussed the camp's impact on its occupants, but limited the narrative understanding behind their construction and the argument of fair treatment. Along with the regional studies at the micro level, personal stories and biographies were used as secondary sources, and the story of German POWs in America was continued. Arnold Kramer assisted Georg Gärtner in writing a memoir and explaining the story of his great escape in 1945. Escaping from a prison camp in New Mexico, Gärtner evaded capture for 37 years. Mentioned in the recent edition of Kramer's Nazi Prisoners of War in America, the two men connected as Gärtner reached out to turn himself in. Fluent in English, Gärtner adapted to life in the United States and lived as a fugitive. He eventually married and had children. He was the only German POW never to be apprehended after the war and repatriated. Although studies on German POWs have been conducted in each region of the United States, studies on the POWs in Michigan remain limited. William Lowe wrote his master's thesis on the German POWs in 1995. Titled Working for 80 cents a day, Lowe documented the labour shortage and payment to POWs in Michigan, determining that despite the low wage, the POWs earned enough money to send back home and afford items from the camp commissary. Studies on Michigan's German POWs continued with Lauren Hahn's Germans in the Orchards, 2000, which documented the experiences of POWs who worked for a local farmer in southwest Michigan. Since no new interpretations exist, given its narrative format, it was one of the first articles to discuss POW letters to Michigan farmers. Kevin Hall, a doctoral student at Central Michigan University, continued this idea, writing The Befriended Enemy, German Prisoners of War in Michigan, 2015. Hall used letters from Frankenmuth and Muskegon, Michigan, demonstrating the cordial relationships between German POWs and Michigan farmers. These direct experiences changed the perception of America as an enemy. The first book published on German POWs in Michigan arrived in 2018, authored by Dr. Gregory D. Sumner, a history professor at the University of Detroit Mercy. Documenting the experiences of prisoners in the camps, Sumner argued the work program created lasting relationships, as Americans embodied their ideals. Ethan Reardon, a master's student at Central Michigan University, privately published his thesis titled 2000 German POWs in Michigan, Planned Re-Education versus Fair Treatment. He asserted that the labor program, the process of POWs working on American farms, re-educated German POWs more successfully than the War Department's re-education program. As the topic of German POWs in the United States has received new life and interest, research into the German POWs in Michigan has grown. However, research is lacking on the violations of War Department stipulations, as documented by the German POW letters throughout the state. Some of the Michigan publications mention prisoner letters, and although they were analysed, historians have not evaluated all the surviving documents. In many current publications, letters from POWs remain uncited. German POWs in the United States experienced humane and similar treatment to American servicemen, as demonstrated by the various regional and state studies completed. However, scholars can conduct more research and studies to fully tell the narrative of German POWs in Michigan, their experiences, and their impact on American history during World War II. The following questions must be answered on the topic of German POWs in Michigan. The primary question is, did the German POWs' experiences exceed the confines laid out within the Geneva Convention, allowing prisoners to form relationships with American farmers, directly lessening their belief in National Socialism? Additional questions include, Did the US follow the Geneva Convention concerning the use of POW labour? Why did the German POWs experience better treatment than their counterparts, leading to accusations of coddling? How could the historical narrative re-establish prisoner of war studies and integrate the teachings within the confines of World War II? Answering these questions requires reviewing the Geneva Conventions and its stipulations, along with the War Department regulations and why camps existed in Michigan. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted men of the German army could work on menial tasks and be used as labour. As such, prisoners worked during the spring, summer and fall months at approximately 30 subcamps throughout the state. During the winter months, POWs stayed at the state's main military installation, Fort Custer. Sent out to work in the crop fields, the prisoners harvested various crops, including apples, cherries, beans, and other staples for the war effort. They established relationships with many farmers, happily working in the fields. One Michigan resident recalled prisoners continued to work, despite being told not to, though this showed the problem of a language barrier. Relationships are further established with correspondence between farmers of German ancestry and German prisoners who exchanged letters for years. The camps placed in Michigan helped relieve the labour shortage in farming communities. However, camp placement alone does not detail prisoners' experiences. To reveal the prisoners' treatment and experience, the primary methodology is to find and translate letters written to Michigan farmers following repatriation. Falling into the realms of military and social history, this project culminated in a statewide search for letters and experiences throughout the 30 POW camps. Many of the uncovered letters are still in German. However, the consensus of letters, approximately 150, determined that the prisoners experienced humane treatment at the hands of their American captors and employers. They experienced treatment similar to that of servicemen or hired hands, rather than enemy combatants. Historical societies and local archives contained additional letters. However, time, care, and age rendered the handwriting illegible, making translation difficult. In addition, War Department documents, accessed through the National Archives, detail camp construction, prisoner rosters, and POW treatment under the 6th Service Command. Although more legal, these documents revealed good to excellent conditions allotted to the POWs within Michigan. Civilians gave the prisoners additional food, blankets, and other amenities in violation of War Department stipulations. The prisoners had opportunities for recreation and English language classes. One camp raised money and built a swimming pond, though they later had to fill in this amenity as the community presented backlash. Another camp, outside Frankenmuth, placed in a German-speaking community, allowed the prisoners to build personal relationships, share culture, and speak about their treatment. Prisoners discussed their treatment with American citizens while accepting food and goodwill. Part of the reason behind Americans' goodwill may have been an inability to differentiate between soldier and enemy. German soldiers replaced American men sent to war, both of whom were young men. The average age, as prisoners arrived on American shores, was 24. Citizens felt disdain as they sent men into the fight, and prisoners were being treated exceptionally in their eyes through food rations, clothing, and recreation time. This led to accusations that the War Department was coddling the German prisoners. This created a situation where Americans struggled to perceive the German prisoners as enemies. Neither did Michigan farmers equate German soldiers with Nazis. They were considered soldiers or workers, depending on the individual farmer. Fraternization was common, as young girls stood at the fence and attempted to talk with the prisoners. There is even a story of 2 girls running off with 2 German POWs for a late-night fling. Only one scholar has published a book about Michigan's German POWs and detailing their experiences. This monograph, by Gregory Sumner, a professor of history at the University of Mercy, Detroit, called Michigan POW Camps in World War II, described prisoners' overall experience during captivity. Sumner conducted interviews with surviving descendants of farmers and attempted to track POWs through an annual event held at Fort Custer National Cemetery in November. In addition, Sumner gathered and reviewed newspapers, while uncovering letters written by POWs to farmers in small historical societies throughout the state. However, untranslated letters in Muskegon and others in Berrien Springs offered further insight into the relationships forged between prisoners and farmers. More analysis of the narrative relationships is necessary to fully understand the relationships built and how German prisoners grew from enemies to friends. Understanding this relationship allows further analysis of the overall narrative of German prisoners in the United States, further connecting this little studied area of American history to the overall story of America in World War II. Letters found at the Berrien Springs Historical Society, Oceana County Historical Society, Frankenmuth Historical Society, and the Lakeshore Museum Center provided a survey of the different regions of Michigan. Many letters remain untranslated. Volunteers copied and translated letters housed at the Historical Society in Frankenmuth into English. Additional sources uncovered in Blissfield, Michigan, a historical society not cited by Dr. Sumner, helped to understand prisoner deaths and their individual experiences. An additional article, published in 2015, also utilized letters from Muskegon Country and Frankenmuth, Michigan, to document German POWs' experiences and their relationships with American farmers. Both publications will be instrumental, as this study into POWs' experiences will follow a similar methodology, though an analysis of all the camps, to uncover how Michigan followed the Geneva Convention and the different letters that exist document the German POW experiences after the war. The process of reviewing this topic will involve an analysis of around 150 letters. As Sumner and Hall reviewed interviews and letters, this study applied a similar methodology. Letters found in Berrien Springs, Frankenmuth, Muskegon, Sparta, and Blissfield, Michigan, assisted in analyzing individual stories. Interviews conducted in Shelby, Michigan, and found online augmented the letters. However, the argument varies by focusing on the prisoners' experiences and the stipulations of the War Department, which were routinely violated by the American public. In addition, the preliminary conclusions showed that relationships between American farmers and prisoners, which often lasted decades, directly impacted how Americans perceived the prisoners. They became workers instead of Nazis. They remained men rather than enemies. One Michigan resident, Otto Herzog, wrote letters back and forth with the prisoners who worked on his farm. His family donated his letters to the Frankenmuth Historical Society in 1994, written in German and translated, documenting the closeness between the men as they discussed weather, conditions in Germany and America, and their families. In one letter, a family discussed the birth of their son, named after their American friend. Yet, beyond this, they became family friends, despite a historical narrative and memory where all German citizens during World War II supported Nazism and Adolf Hitler. Evaluations of the War Department documents, specifically documents from the Office of the Provost General, including letters written concerning POW treatment, as well as treatment of Japanese American internees, demonstrated the excellent treatment and excellent facilities created for POWs on American soil. These surviving letters, experiences, documents, and letters challenged the proposed narrative of Nazism, even elevating the treatment of POWs above the required status. Reviewing this semi-known element of Michigan history, the narrative of German POWs returns to the narrative of the German POWs' experiences. This can be used to compare the situations among other German POWs, particularly those on the Eastern Front or among Allied camps in Europe. American History Survey classes can reincorporate this story. Many classes concerning World War II gloss over the fact that America held POWs. Instead, the focus is on the Japanese Americans, interned in camps. This is also a comparable element concerning the German POWs, as both groups stayed behind barbed wire, yet their experiences differed concerning interactions with other American citizens. Overall, given the primary information source, the United States exceeded the confines of the Geneva Convention. Using German POW labor, the farmers of Michigan established rapport with the Germans, resulting in letters between former prisoners and farmers until as late as 1995. The prisoners experienced recreational activities and full bellies compared to other internees in America or their counterparts in POW camps throughout the world. Comparing the chronological data from the letters to secondary sources and additional journal articles on prisoner of war studies, it is possible to determine the validity of the prisoners' experiences. In addition, teaching this narrative in US history courses allows Americans to discover unknown elements of their past